Research, GIDR Ahmedabad, and he's also the president of Orissa Economics Association. And for the information of other participants, Orissa Economics Association also has a journal that is called Orissa Economic Journal, and this is listed in the UGC care. And Professor Keshab is the executive editor of the journal, Orissa Economic Journal. And with this brief introduction, Professor Keshab Das, now I invite him to start his deliberation. Sir, it's over to you. So.
Thank you so much, Amarendra, and I'm very, very happy that the whole of morning session, I would rather imagine, I think it was a series of presentations and very intense discussion with Professor Mala Ramanathan. I think it was a major event that we had in the morning session. And with that, I'm sure that, because I'm personally very happy about that event, because it's an extremely, I think it's a subject not much known about actually. And so in that sense, and also very, very interactive style of her presentation, that also I appreciated. I don't think I can even imagine to be anywhere close to that, because I think she really engaged the participants in a major way. So that is very highly appreciated so far as his economic association is concerned, but then also as an individual scholar, I think I very much appreciate that approach. So with that, so we move on to the second presentation. This is about review of literature. I mean, so kind of a very broadly, this is posed and review of literature in social science. So what I'll do, let me share the screen. Is it seen, Amarendra?
Yes, it is now. Yes,
okay.
You can see it.
So, so before I get into the actual presentation, the details, let me start with a slide. A few years back, in fact, sometime in 2009, I sort of happened to attend a conference at ISEC Bangalore, the Institute of Social and Economic Change. So this was a very major event which actually was celebrating, I think, the 100th year of Professor V.K. Abhirao. And this was attended by a large number of very, very senior social scientists who were sort of directors and vice chancellors and very, very established academics, very senior academics, in fact. So this deliberation was sort of all about so what has happened to social science research, and so discussions around that by people who were quite familiar. And at the end of the event, I think it was a 3-day event. So at the end of the event, so there was a newspaper report, which is very telling. So I don't have to explain what the title at least suggests. So there was a massive concern in terms of the decline of quality of social science research, and this concern was expressed by those individuals who have been directly involved in building up a kind of a strong social science base in the country for several decades. So that was a major sort of concern with which we started. That was in 2009. Later, like sometime in 2017, as I have given the reference here, and also later in 2021. So there have been sort of major work done by the ICSSR and also with the support of the IDRC. So there was a major sort of project which was undertaken to evaluate what is happening to the social science research in India. As you know that in the early decades, particularly between 1950 and 1970, it was actually the UGC, the University Grants Commission, which was the sort of sole funder of social science research in India. And later, that is particularly since 1969, since when the Indian Council of Social Science Research started. So much of the funding also was rooted through that. So there's a lot of hope was there that maybe there will be a lot of focused research done and the quality would increase. Again, this sort of study that was done sort of suggested that though we might have done little better than, let's say, what was talked about in 2009. In fact, in a few cases in terms of quality, some pointed out that we might have done a little better than even China, a little better than Brazil. But in general, there was a concern about the quality issues and all that sort of related not so much only to the question of funding, but also how the project proposals were articulated and what kind of sort of readings these sort of proposals were based upon, and what kind of sort of information was being used. So there was a huge concern again. So even as recent as in 2021, so we are still worried about a kind of about the declining quality of social science research in India. So with this, we are, and there have been a number of reports, particularly the report by A. Vaidyanathan. It is on the ICSR site if you'd like to see sometime. There have been several reports, also studies in the EPW by Partha Chatterjee and others, MSS Pandya and Partha Chatterjee. So there's a lot of sort of writings about this. And then so what really was sort of at the heart of this crisis, or sort of why, despite a large number of students, teachers, and departments sort of working towards social science research, why this quality issue suffered. So there have been issues raised, and some pointed to the fund constraints, some said that maybe we didn't have qualified or teacher researchers or good proposals. And also there is a concern that maybe many researchers were probably not very sort of committed to pursue research as a career. Maybe they're looking for sort of jobs elsewhere, private sector jobs maybe. So many were sort of using this as a stepping stone. So be that as it may, there was a lot of issues around social science research and why it was on the decline. To this audience, I'm not the one to tell the purport and import of research. In fact, I'm sure you all are at a stage where you all know this, but then there are several ways by which one interprets the purpose of social science research. Like some would sort of say that this is essentially to describe certain sort of processes or describe certain events, and if you explain, you sort of predict and make certain prescriptions, maybe sort of your sort of role as a social scientist is sort of taken care. But there are others sort of who probably are sort of asking for it is not just enough to describe or explain a situation. In fact, you have to sort of create new knowledge. You have to inform policy. So there has to be a kind of a very active component of social science research, which relates to sort of creating new knowledge and also inform policy. And to the, even many have also argued of late that it should also aid advocacy. So your social science research is not just a kind of a very private enterprise, as you would like to know it, but then this should also serve a certain larger social purpose. And sort of to that end, maybe it should also be reflected in certain kinds of policy domain, whether it is done through the state or certain active, dynamic, non-state actors, but then to inform them, to support such activities. Maybe social science research has a very significant role to play. And then Amartya Sen tells us that it's actually it's not just enough even to advise a policy or inform policy or to describe, but also to actually to get at the truth, and more than that, speaking truth to the power. That is to be bold enough, to be objective enough to state state the objective realities as we find on ground. So there is a much larger role of the social scientists sort of they have to play, even as many also argue that the social scientist is not necessarily is the ultimate policymaker. Maybe sort of he or she informs or maybe participates at some level, but then so that is a larger political process, for instance. So maybe in which the social scientist may not have a strong role, but then to inform objectively and also to share the grounded realities based on one's work, and not just one's own work and observation, but also to appreciate. So there may have been a large number of sort of enquiries done prior to the individual researchers sort of initiating her acknowledgement of the work done by others, irrespective of the fact that whether these are essentially scholars or sort of they could be civil society organization activists or whichever source, but to the extent there has been a kind of a prior information, prior inquiry, prior knowledge existing, I think that needs to be acknowledged and maybe to an extent to be also made use of in one's own social science research. And there have been also concern, in fact, I'm also referring to part of these 2-3 like the meeting of 2009 and subsequent lot of literature around this. In fact, there's a very interesting paper at the CDS which also came up on this concerns in social science. So there is this concern about a lot of repetitive work. And like, let's say sort of you pick up one particular let's say government program and sort of you think that it is just enough that you sort of do it in one more district or one more state. So very little sort of new knowledge or new inquiries. So research, particularly the PhD thesis in several universities, sort of found that sort of these were essentially very like similar kind of work which had already been done, and this was sort of described as a wastage of research. And there have been other issues of like maybe there was very limited sort of interaction between the individual scholars, the peer group, as you say, or even between educational sort of or research organizations. So all these probably sort of influenced what kind of work research we have been doing and whether and how they have been relevant or not. And as I did mention that this kind of institutional collaboration or sort of exchanges of ideas. So these actually have been very much on the decline. In fact, we're back in sort of like mid 1980s or 80s, much of the, let's say, so late 70s to let's say almost in mid 80s, there have been a lot of effort made by particularly the ICSSR and the UGC. A lot of efforts were made where actually annual sort of events were sort of conducted, whereby students, the scholars who were sort of like halfway through or in the initial stages of their research would actually come together and to discuss, even if we all were working on very different kinds of subjects and with very different kind of even disciplines. So with that, I think that very major need to listen to others, to interact, helping how to articulate. So all this probably has been very much on the decline, and this has been very so like it has been almost like an individual sort of initiative in social science research. Then that also leads to the next issue, which in fact in the previous presentation it was so very obvious that there's so much to learn from another discipline, for instance. I mean that discipline which is not your very own, but then there's so much to learn from another discipline. So that sort of emphasis on interdisciplinarity, and especially when you are trying to explain a certain sort of process or sort of like you want to sort of follow certain kinds of a trajectory of a certain event, I think it's very essential to understand that how other disciplines might have sort of observed this whole phenomenon. If I may give you a very let's say quick example of let's say uneven development as a kind of a theme, like a regional disparities in development as we generally talk about, or uneven development, or like sort of issues in why certain regions have been sort of doing very well in terms of sort of responding to some various sort of policy development, policy initiatives, whereas some others are sort of probably lagging behind. Suppose a kind of an issue like this, so it is not just purely an issue which is to be dealt by a neoclassical economist by talking about location quotients, or sort of talking about sort of specialization coefficients, or talking about the industry and location theory alone. I mean, you really have to talk about whether these very different kinds of development experiences across spaces sort of are to be attributed to factors which need not necessarily be economic. There may be political factors, there may be historical factors. So there are several such issues which sort of depend on what all strategies to be adapted if you are thinking in terms of sort of, let's say, achieving what we may call as a balanced development. And so much of the sort of inquiries is not just enough to talk about what, how many, and when. So it is like that is too much of an empiricist approach to social science research is at times problematic because there are two issues. One is that the veracity, the reliability, the authenticity of the evidence that we are talking about. If you are talking purely on kind of an empirical sources, so unless we also have two more sort of questions added to that, why and how, I think social science research probably will not be very relevant in the absence of those sort of questions, which also tell us much more than what the empirical evidence suggests. Even if I may also add a small point here, there have been several sort of several subsectors for which we may have empirical data, but the data itself may be very much questionable. I think so. These are the issues which probably needs to be raised. And so from interdisciplinarity, let me also make one more step ahead. So what should I broadly call as trespassing? This is sort of idea I have taken from Albert Hirschman, who was essentially sort of talking about like how you could in fact how you could be sort of you have to be sort of fairly open and sort of broad approach you have to adopt, especially when you are dealing with such things as ethics, culture, identity, voice, democracy, violence, happiness. So these are not the issues which actually one single discipline can help us understand, or even one single source of data, empirical data, that is not going to help us very much beyond a point. So this trespassing, also like going beyond your own discipline, while in fact not really rejecting or not sort of demeaning your own discipline, I think that leads to a situation where we actually sort of learn to appreciate what we may call as a severality of perceptions, and maybe that will help us understand the problematic better. And I've used the word problematic. Let me take a while to explain that may be a little useful as I sort of proceed further. So this problematic, please notice that this is TIQUE, so it is not TIC. The problematic here is like, if I may give you, let's say, a very simple example. Let's presume that we are sort of at a traffic crossing. So maybe waiting for the green light to come. So as sort of we are waiting, let's say I'm on a scooter or a bike, as I'm waiting for the light to turn green, and those very few sort of moments that I have, I find a kind of money. She is begging for a little money so that she could eat something. So at that traffic junction, when I have very little time and I have to move forward once the light turns green, so I have a problem to face. That is a problem of poverty and a small girl child. And so I think this problem, if I see that as a problem alone, so I could probably solve that by maybe, I don't know, maybe I give her a 5 rupee or a 10 rupee coin coin, and I think I have done my duty and I move on. So if I sort of think through that, like for instance, if I start wondering that why there was this girl who should have been in the school is begging at a traffic junction. If I may think in terms of what kind of sort of financial background she comes from, whether she is coming from a migrant family, whether the state has completely failed in terms of it's sort of fulfilling its promises of providing, let's say, free education and free food at school to that child. So where the problem is not solved by my giving a 5 rupee or a 10 rupee coin to that child at that particular moment. So this leads to a larger sort of inquiry. So that is what actually we should largely describe as the problematic, where sort of like you have much broader, so you see the much broader interconnections of a single event with several other, whether it relates to policies or whether it relates to certain kinds of discrimination which is in the society. So all that comes in. And as a social scientist, I think that trespassing to look beyond an immediate problem as a single individual event, I think that is probably what leads us to probably read a little more on what others have been saying. And that's where I think the whole significance of review of literature comes in. So it's as I did mention. So it is. So we really have to see that what kind of knowledge already exists, and whether one could sort of assimilate that, one could find gaps in that, and whether one could probably move ahead. And then, of course, there are other processes of doing research, but then I sort of focus on the review of literature part. So I give you some very simple examples of research problems, and this sort of picked up from various sources. I'm not saying these are the only sort of issues to be concerned about. So essentially, so the research problems or the research this could really vary. It all depends on what kind of interest you have, what kind of discipline you come from, what kind of readings you have, what kind of issues have bothered you. So on that basis, I think sort of you can have very, and particularly in social sciences, of course, you can have a lot of interdisciplinary themes. If you're talking about, let's say, farmers, suicide and agrarian distress, I think it really sort of goes much beyond a kind of a very focused economistic discussion. There have been several such issues relating to globalization, for instance. So several such issues, and if you're talking about broad issues relating to human rights, sort of like a varieties of new forms of violence, for instance, and how they are sort of affecting societies, how they're affecting economies, how they have destroyed sort of opportunities for jobs, how they have destroyed infrastructure. So there are varieties of ways by which kind of new forms of research which are now being undertaken. And within that, sort of like we are also looking into very sort of important cross-cutting themes, like, for instance, the role of varieties of institutions, whether the formal or informal institutions. This whole question about gender, for instance, and all these probably are going to be very much part of our larger inquiries. So the research problems in the early stages, I think we need to keep it here open mind. And this is just one little example of a particular thesis on transnationalization of Indian media. So essentially, sort of one is sort of trying to figure out what kind of larger research questions are there, and then from that, like what kind of specific objectives of the study that can be sort of approached. So these are sort of flow processes, and all these lead to our basic readings. I'm sort of showing this partly to suggest that this depends on what kind of literature we should be reading, and what kind of sort of literature we should actually be using, and in what manner. And so by on the one hand, by sort of taking an approach of interdisciplinarity, kind of having a kind of a broad sort of mindset in terms of like appreciating sort of like diversity of views, even on a specific subject. So with that, maybe we sort of proceed to do a kind of a existing available literature. I'll be talking about what kind of literature. I'll be talking about that very soon. And within that, and once on the basis of a varieties of sort of, let's say, reviews of the studies that we do, maybe we should have also figure out that there have been certain kinds of issues, certain kinds of information, certain kinds of arguments, certain kinds of facts, probably they are sort of missing or probably presented in a kind of an inconsistent manner and maybe not matching with, let's say, certain kinds of accepted theoretical knowledge we might be having on a certain subject. So all this probably needs us to identify the gap in literature. In fact, one of the significant jobs as part of review of literature is not just to sort of summarize what others have written, but also to figure out that what are actually the sort of like what are the areas in which maybe less work has been done, or some work is sort of absent, or some issues are missing. And I think that sort of helps us clarify our own position as to what research objectives, research questions we should have, and that might also help us what kind of methodologies that we might sort of pursue. And in terms of the material, the kind of material that we should be looking forward to, I think there is no such fixed notion. As I said, that the knowledge sources are so varied. So this could be sort of theoretical material sort of relating to policies, or anecdotal material, or even sort of like some of those standard like journal articles, books. So varieties of sources one can probably sort of access that, and all that probably helps us to begin with. As we all know, that it is very important that we really have a fairly broad-based review of literature. And within that, let me sort of come to one small point, that is like when you are sort of exposed to so much of such a variety of let's say reading material, for instance, or even sort of material from the internet. So we have to be little careful about the significance of one's own discipline. Suppose I belong to, let's say, history is my discipline, or political science. So I think that dominant discipline probably should be there in the back of the mind. And then also we need to sort of ensure that the data or the information that you have, whether how authentic they are, how reliable, and whether they are actually sort of like how relevant they are for understanding the context and process of our own sort of research purpose, and what kind of sort of inferences, how much inference we can sort of derive from these sources. So these are in very general terms, but then these are kind of a broad guidelines, if I may say, so which we might sort of offer for the literature that we'll be referring to. So what I'll be doing very quickly through a few slides is not exactly to talk so much about the literature that we are generally familiar with, or let's say the literature which is sort of like usually available as in a published or easily accessible form, like let's say you go to a library, for instance, or you sort of access like you read a journal, for instance. So there have been several such publications sort of which are like in the so-called formal domain, which of course one needs to sort of use. These may be publications of, so this could be government publications, this could be sort of like regular journals, for instance, the books, etc. But then I sort of want to focus a little time when I'm talking about the review of literature. So there is something called this gray literature. So I thought I'd spend a little time on this. So this is, in fact, we are talking about also about kind of literature, also a lot of writings, lot of material, which may not be sort of published through a regular channel, or which are sort of often referred to as mimeographed or processed or unpublished sources. And I've given a few examples here and there, for instance, whether it's a PhD thesis, whether it's a kind of occasional paper, whether it's a conference proceeding, even a newspaper article, literary texts for that matter. And so a variety of these sources are being used by used by scholars, and particularly I used to make give one or two small examples here. So you might be wondering why we sort of bring in literary text, for instance. And there have been very interesting work, like if anyone is working on, let's say, indebtedness, indebtedness of, let's say, a kind of a family, a landless farming, farm dependent family, and indebtedness, which is actually a major issue in current times. We're talking about rural credit crisis, for instance, and this indebtedness issue, like if you sort of read a very useful doctoral thesis, which was done by Professor Sahid Amin, who was a professor of history. In fact, so that PhD thesis in history, in economic history, which was done at the Oxford University, sort of makes the first major reference to the work done by Premchand, talking about the indebtedness during the colonial period, how those sugarcane sort of producers, the small sugarcane producers who were sort of leasing in land, so how so in what production arrangements the farmers continued to remain indebted for generations. So that literary text, which probably sort of maybe sort of presented not in an academic format, but gives a lot of insights into the crisis of rural indebtedness, which is of great use to explain maybe some of the current situations. There have been several such. I mean, if in Kerala, for instance, there is very interesting book by Thakadi Shivasankar Pillai, who was a Gyanpith Award winner. So written a book called Kayar. Kayar is the coconut fiber. And so this book, in fact, it's basically it's a novel. It's a novel sort of based on sort of 18th and 19th century social history of Kerala, but then talks so much about a varieties of agrarian relations. It talks about sort of like displacement of individuals from land, and it also talks about unemployment in certain specific occupations, and of course talking about what kind of the local the role of the local state, how they played in that. So there are several such sources which are very useful, in fact, to get an insight. So the gray literature I'm sort of highlighting, by this I'm not sort of trying to suggest that the other published sources are not useful. I'm saying apart from that, there are also very many such sources, and so which I would imagine that, and of course there are sort of varieties of audio and audio records and movies and a lot of internet sources you can sort of access. That is for a kind of an initial stage of understanding or to better understand a certain process. The second sort of major source, which again in current times many of the researchers probably either people do not know or they do not want to sort of refer to this. This is this whole rich source of information on a variety of issues leading to the social, economic, and political development, which are sort of available in the archives. And so the state archive, so this is something which really it's a major repository of a varieties of a wide range of sort of records which are not generally available in the public domain. And this probably tells us or gives us a lot of information about a large number of processes, whether that's a political process or social processes, how they might have influenced certain development outcomes. So it is extremely important that if we, I mean, this includes the archives also includes, apart from these government records, it includes a large number of sort of old newspapers and a varieties of sort of private records, which might give you a lot of insight. Typically, these are sort of the reference period is at least 30-year-old. I mean, that is how most of this information are given. And so it is very important that with this rich resource, which also, I mean, the archives also have a lot of regional offices, etc. I think this needs to be referred to. I'm sort of making very strong sort of cases for this kind of unusual sort of literature because there has been a kind of a tendency that like, so we very often think that if you have access to, very often students, PhD scholars who come to me, so they ask for like, so why don't you give us some kind of a particular, let's say, site where I can sort of download data for last 30 to 40 years on a particular sector, and I sort of be done with my thesis. So a large number of such sort of work, like if you're focusing on certain sectors, certain events, I think it's very, very important to know you have to do it with some kind of a historical perspective or perspectives which are much beyond your given disciplines. And for that, maybe some of these sources you have to refer to. Again, this is another set of sources which I'm not very sure whether you are at all familiar with this. And these are all, in fact, very important documents which are sort of like, these are publications, but the first two are in fact publications. If you did not know this, Lok Sabha debates and Rajya Sabha debates, extremely rich source of information on every little development decision that is being discussed. A policy is formed. These are all in fact sort of contained in these sort of publications of the parliament. So please, definitely, and very, very, very current debates. And one of the very interesting part of this is that you often also get access to a lot of so-called classified data as these are sort of informed through what is known as the starred questions in the parliament or in the assemblies. So there have been several sources, including the All India Reporter, which is sort of mostly used by the legal professions. So many of these also contain a lot of insights, lot of information, lot of processes, and it also tells you about the various stakeholders who might have sort of contributed to or participated in a certain development decision making. So it is extremely important that we actually look beyond the kind of a whatever like official statistics is given, like you're sort of obsessed with a certain kind of statistical techniques. I think you really have to look into the larger processes which may have influenced that. And of course, there have been several other sources like this. And this is probably more useful for people who are doing some kind of a anthropological studies or historical studies, or like some like very often like doing certain sort of personal narratives. A lot of this information again are found from the private records, whether they are with individuals or whether it's with certain institutions. In fact, I may mention of one very well-known professor of economics in the University of Hyderabad. He's retired now, Professor M. Achireddy. I don't know if you've heard of him. So his work was based on the records of sort of farmers, and like that gave tremendous insights into this whole cropping pattern. And also the farmers' knowledge, the local farmers' knowledge about the climate change, and on that basis for choosing what kind of crops to be grown when. So there are a lot of this kind of information which we might sort of get from the private records. And if I may take a little while, there is one more sort of similar example. There are two scholars, one Mihir Shah and one T.K. Sundari Ravindran. I'm sure Professor Mala Ravindran knows them. So these two people, in fact, sort of coming from, let's say, doing their doctorate in PhD from JNU, in fact, we're sort of basing their data on sort of privately collected records of the farmers in Chingalput in Tamil Nadu district. And one of the most interesting things that they found was that there was a huge collection of these private records with the landless, untouchable pariah, so-called pariah households, who in fact kept these records, which sort of told them that these records were in fact sort of created or sort of maintained or created by the local rulers or zamindars or whoever, so stating that keeping the sun, moon, the stars as witness, so and so, that is the farmer in question or the agricultural laborer in question, will not be able to possess land during his life or for the generation that would be coming. So the landlessness, which is sort of often linked to a certain caste identity, it has actually a kind of a basis which is absolutely absurd, which is sort of based on this kind of. So these records that these two research scholars they sort of put their hands on, so give a very, very kind of a new idea about that, whether it is something which is like so how this landlessness relating to certain caste identity, how this has been formed. So there's a lot of new insights which came from that, and the questions of identity that we are talking about today. So many of these things were sort of addressed through this kind of information. So what I'm trying to suggest is there are several such sources which probably gives us very, very sort of interesting ideas, like someone called Professor Uda Rajan. Again, we all know him as a very eminent demographer. So he sort of much of his PhD thesis was based on records from a certain church. So it's very important that we should not dismiss the source or the literature which is not necessarily coming from a kind of a so-called formal or the published domain. So it is very important that the social scientist has actually an open mind and probably looks into a variety of information. But then, having said all this, we are living in a very different time where the digital media has completely taken over our thinking, our sources of research, etc., etc. And much of the review of literature that we are talking about, in fact, I know of many, many students who simply sort of pick it up from these sources, and very often I do not know whether Mala Madam did mention or not. I mean, some of the sources, of course, you can read, but then you probably cannot refer to like a source like Wikipedia, for instance, which is sort of not an authentic source. So varieties of, and the blogs, if it is an institutional blog, a formal institutional blog, maybe you can use, but maybe not a personal blog. So these are sort of the newer challenges that we are facing in terms of a lot of information which is available online, but we have to be a little careful as to whether that can be directly used as a formal source in a research work. And the next issue, which I'm sure again must have been dealt with in great detail by Mala Madam. So this is this whole thing about so stating or presenting someone else's work as your own without making any formal acknowledgement of the source or the researcher in question. So this is a very, very serious offense, and I think in the recent years, most universities have been extremely serious about it. This is actually now considered a crime. You might actually lose your registration because of this, and this is a serious offense which we need to sort of avoid, sort of copying someone and without acknowledging. So there are no, at least so far as I know, I try to figure out so what could be the ways by which sort of like we can sort of avoid this sort of this activity. Maybe we need to exercise discretion and with certain responsibility. And somewhere I read that it's sort of maybe not more than 40 words, but with even more than 40 words without with citation could also be considered as an act of plagiarism, even for that long prose. So varieties of ways by which we may actually, while we refer to a source, we should also ensure that we are not completely sort of like lifting the entire material and copying and pasting. And there have been, as you know, there are several such sites where this can actually be very easily verified. And as Amarendra did mention in the very beginning of today's event, that there have been several ways by which this quality check by individual by individual sites or individual journals. So it is very important that we avoid this plagiarism, because the tendency is that because these are available in the public domain and online, so we often sort of get with that. So very briefly and quickly, maybe So how broadly we go about the review of literature, uh, while we sort of pay attention to both the formal or the published or the secondary source materials, which are extremely useful for a better understanding, for a better argumentation. Maybe it is also useful to look around for information, for material which may not be, or which may be roughly be described as gray literature. So that is actually that also helps us articulating certain issues properly. And it is very important that maybe I do not know to this audience or in current times whether individual scholars are willing to make smaller notes, and that's how we used to do in our young days. So maybe it's very, very important that while we read a certain article or read any particular text, maybe we sort of make a little note, and that also helps us both sort of improving the quality of writing, and maybe that is one way we probably remember some of those arguments better. And it is very important that we also have a sense of objectivity, like sort of we probably should try to question some of the, whether it's a database, whether it's a certain kind of argument. So maybe, so as we sort of read through articles or books, maybe it is very, very important, including the data sources. It's very important that we also try to make some critical comments on that. And then probably we sort of move to kind of a situation of synthesizing and so trying to contextualize our readings, whatever notes we have made, and with the discipline in the back of our mind. How to contextualize that review of literature for the next steps in the thesis. As often we sort of find when we talk of, despite talking all about review of literature, very often, and I've just given an example here. So very often people sort of present the review of literature because many think that this is kind of a ritual to be performed, and this review of literature is a chapter which has to be there, and somehow some studies have to be referred to. And so very often, so like this is a study on regional rural banks, and in which so different committee reports. So this have been sort of like given in a like different 1, 2, 3, 4 committee reports, and a little sort of statements about that. So we are not very sure whether these reports have anything to do with the focus of the thesis or not. So the scholar, in fact, has just shown that I have gone through, let's say, 20 such reports, and so it is given in a chronological manner. And this kind of these are the examples, and then several studies, so which are sort of like, what I may use a word like stacked, like they are sort of like as if in a shelf you are keeping one book on top of the other, without ensuring that whether there is any link between the two sort of source materials that one has used, whether there is any link between them, whether they agree, whether a certain set of readings they hold a similar view and another set an opposite view. So we have no idea as to how critically to look into a variety of literature that we are referring to. And very often we think we go in for stacking the literature in a format, and this is an extremely problematic way of doing review of literature. In fact, the review of literature, as you all definitely know, is always issue based actually. So it has to be based on certain questions which are relevant to your own thesis. It is not that I have a large number of references and I sort of like put them like XYZ said this, and without really going in for contextualizing that whole thing. Here, let me also give you a little maybe a clue or suggestion that very often very often we in fact find what is known as the review articles. And as you do a review of literature, you at times come across like individual articles which in itself sort of presents a review of a large number of studies in that particular area. And that is, in fact, there is something called the Journal of Reviews. So there is a journal called the Journal of Reviews, which also very often thematic thematic reviews of literature that is presented. And so those are some of these studies, like the review of literature or in this journal. So very often you'll find that how a large number of studies have been referred to, but then sort of how they have been sort of maybe certain kinds of groupings have been made, or certain kinds of interconnections have been made, or certain kinds of gaps could be identified from certain kinds of resources. So those issues have been sort of pointed out. So it may be very useful to also, if possible, and if it is available, to also try to read some of those review articles. So with that, I move to the next thing. So which is again, and this is again an example, but this is also very important as we know about the citing. And so there are different sort of formats. One of the more commonly used citations in social sciences in most journals, that I'm not saying that's the only one, but this APA style is what is largely followed. But the EPW, for instance, sort of follows a slightly different format, which are given here. So the one thing is, whichever format you follow, and these are sort of, there are a lot of examples one can see, but what is most important is that all references must be complete in the sense of the author, the title's name, the publisher, year, etc., etc. And that this has to be largely and entirely, this has to be consistent within a certain style, the reference style that we are following. And very often many people ignore this, and many theses that we normally examine, we see that there's a lot of lapses in review of literature. At times, we know of instances where PhD theses have been rejected because the references have not been cited either completely or in a consistent manner. So please try to avoid that. And this is our last slide. So this is something which I have sort of visualized. I'm not saying this is the best way to sort of go about for review of literature, but then I thought, like, if you like the initial phase, if I may say, the top triangle, if I may see that. So maybe sort of the first phase is maybe to take a fairly broad approach to all kinds of related studies, in fact. So not to be really bogged down by your own discipline, but to be more open to ideas, to anything which we may not finally even use, and also thematic service, as I did mention. And from that, some kind of trying and making definite small notes as we move on. That's extremely important. And to interpret the views, whether we are able to, in fact, sort of have, okay, these are the 2-3 dominant views so far as a particular issue is concerned, and also to make a critique if you find that something is not well articulated, some information is not adequate. So that, and also if some studies have given us some ideas, but which are not sort of fully developed in a particular paper. So all that, and that leads us to what is very often described as the point of departure. So that is the kind of the central sort of issue, or the central issue which is part of the review of literature, that from the huge literature that you have referred to, you have reviewed, you have sort of made notes, you have interpreted, understood, and so what is that is missing, and why the next part is about, like, why your study is going to be useful, or why a study of another kind has to be undertaken. So to articulate those gaps, and also to sort of have then much more than sort of like a distill the large amount of literature that one had referred to in the earlier phase, maybe distill that. And probably the last important point is how to contextualize that review of literature identifying the gaps, and also to ensure that your study might contribute to new knowledge and or help us understand a certain social or economic or political process better. Thank you. Thank you, Amarendra.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir.
Just a moment. Just a moment.
Okay. What is this sound? I'm breathing or SARS breathing? Okay. So thank you so much, sir. We had a very detailed presentation on the review of literature. I think many people might not have heard of these things also, like particularly the unconventional, which we like particularly the archives. And for the information of the audience, sir's PhD thesis work involves a lot of archival works. And and also the parliamentary things. And then in the new age, a lot of new online materials have also come up. So how can we take advantage of all these materials and do a qualitative review of literature that has been now pointed out by Professor Keshab Das. So thank you very much, sir. And now we may take some questions. I think there are two participants who have raised their hand. So first, Amit Kumar Patnaik. Amit, you would like to ask some question? Amit, you had raised hand, so you can unmute and ask if you have anything.
Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead, Amit.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, actually, my queries are clear, but the thing that I'm asking is, sir, the slides that is presented by sir, can we avail that slides or can we avail that things for a further reading?
The recording of this presentation will be available on the YouTube channel of Orissa Economics Association. So you can watch the video.
Okay, sir. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Yes. And then Deepa Manthur. Am I spelling it correctly? So Deepa, would you like to ask anything? You have raised your hand. Deepa, are you there? Do you want to ask anything or by mistake? You have, okay, no questions. No, you have raised your hand, that's why. Okay, that is fine. So here anybody would like to ask? Yes. So here is a participant who wants to ask question. Tasmita, yes, go ahead. Sir, can you listen to her? Be louder or you can come.
Not very, little louder may be better.
Yeah, so she will come here. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for this.
Can you listen, sir, now?
Yes.
For this beautiful presentation.
It's silent.
Oh, sorry, sir. Okay, sorry.
I think I can.
Can you listen now, sir?
Yes, please ask.
Sir, I want to ask.
I can hear your voice. Yes, go ahead, please.
Sir, how much should be the ideal time for literature review? That is, we cannot go on reading and reading. So, at what point of time we should stop and start writing? Means, I want to ask that where we should stop our literature review in PhD work.
Uh, Actually, that's a very interesting question you asked me. Uh, in fact, let me put it this way: the review of literature should be there till just a few days before you submit your first draft. So let me put it that way, because it's extremely important, and particularly for a good scholar, it's very, very important that we keep track of the new information that we might be sort of finding as we sort of move on, and at times, let's say particularly PhD or any project which takes longer time. So in the intervening period, there may be new information coming. So I think you really have to keep an open mind, and you should be ready to incorporate newer material if you find it even at a later stage. So there is no such time as I stop review of literature and then move forward. I think so that is the flexibility and openness that we should have. But then, of course, there is a limit to your submission time, so it should not go too close to that. But otherwise, in fact, many of the researchers, in fact, very often, particularly PhD researchers, they do refer to literature at a later stage. And in fact, because you have asked this, and if Amarendra allows me 1 or 2 minutes, I want to give a little example, which is linked to this this question. Like for instance, in 1991, we know of a very important scholar who was working on international trade, and particularly trade India and USSR, and the trade, and maybe that candidate was about second or third year into the thesis, and all the review of literature was over, issues were done, the data were collected, interpreted, and in 1991, the USSR broke up. And so there was nothing like USSR after 1991. So when the candidate was in the middle of the doctoral research and sort of with all the discussions that he had, so it was a huge crisis. Just similarly, I at least know of another candidate who was working on the whole peace process in Sri Lanka, and that was when the crisis was, the Tamil insurgency was at its peak. So at one point, in fact, the candidate he could not make a trip to Sri Lanka. So the entire PhD thesis had to be sort of like he had to give up because he could not collect a lot of material, research material, which he was planning to collect, and he had collected some up to a certain point, but because of the crisis, that did not happen. So, but then both these scholars, in fact, they have come up with very good thesis and incorporating these new unexpected changes that happened and influenced not only their research objectives and questions, but also they have to include new perspectives, new literature in their thesis. So I think it's very important that we include work even at a later stage.
So this is also the gray area of doing review of literature. Yes, so there is no black and white rules.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know.
And there is another question like, how can our review of literature be authentic?
So far as some of the published data sources, like if you're talking about more empirical data sources, I'm referring to, like which are sort of published by, let's say, the government, so that the state government or central government or even international bodies like, let's say, IMF, etc. So that is one part of it. But otherwise, if you are referring to a variety of other sources, as I did mention that, like sources, if you are taking from, let's say, the internet sources, even empirical data sources, I have myself cross-checked data from the India stat on the annual survey of industries, which would not match with the original data source. So it's very important that we are a little careful. At the same time, what I would think is not so much of the authenticity also relates to if you can make some comments on improving the data set. Or suppose you are trying to make a comment that, okay, certain database is dated. Like suppose you are working in the year 2022 and the latest data on a particular sector, let's say, is available for, let's say, 2014-15. Like, for instance, the Reserve Bank of India data on the share of gross bank credit to village industries, for instance. I mean, if this is an information which was, so after 2013, that data is no longer available. If you are sort of doing it for the MSME's data, like in which I do some work, we know that the most recent data, the census was done way back in 2006-7. So what I'm saying, it is not just only a question of reliability, but also in terms of whether we can make a comment on whether these data sets are dated or not. The third thing relates to if you can make some contribution. In fact, we have done some work for improving the quality of data collection of the NSS, the National Sample Survey data collection instruments, in which, for instance, when you are sort of collecting data on labor, you also might like to know about the mode of payment, like whether it's paid by time rate or piece rate. So issues like that, they are not actually part of the original questionnaire. So if you are doing a research on labor and wages, I think one little comment you should also make, that maybe the one or two questions relating to the mode of payment should also be included in that. So what I'm saying is, like, you must contribute in whichever possible way as you do your review of literature. So that is the suggestion I can make. But otherwise, for the authenticity, you can always check with the peers, the experts, so they can always be most helpful, actually.
There is a question in a published article. What do you have to look out for when reviewing it? Also, what do you mean by synthesize? Is it advisable to read the whole article or book when reviewing, or you can read only the abstract?
In fact, before I respond to this question, let me, I suddenly remembered some similar anecdote. I'll get back to the question, but then I was suddenly reminded, like a kind of a similar presentation I was making in Gujarat University. A large number of people had come from different universities of the state. So after whatever the presentation, so there was one young person, and I think very well-meaning question that he had posed. He said, sir, if I do not want to read anything, any book or literature, is there a way by which I can pay? And is there a website where I give my, like a Google search, I give my one or two keywords and I get the review of literature done? In fact, for a moment, I was quite stunned, because at least you are now telling that you want to read at least the abstract, if not the full article. So the other person did not want to read anything. In fact, it's just entire review of literature. He was asking me that if, apart from giving this lecture and explaining them and requesting them to make notes on a small paper, he was asking whether there is a website where he was ready to pay for that. And in fact, I must also say there are websites like that. There are websites like that where you can actually pay, and you can, in fact, but then the point is not so much, it's not a strategy for the time being, actually. So you are a social scientist, so beyond getting your degree or a paper published, so there is a larger responsibility that you have for the society. So I would imagine that, so that is the most significant driving force for this profession. And in that, I think if it is an article, you must necessarily read the whole thing, not just the abstract. That is my very clear answer. The book, if you think that the book has several chapters and maybe many chapters are on diverse themes, and you can choose your relevant topic. But let me repeat a request that please definitely make, you have a notebook or something, so definitely make some, you please write down. So only then you remember. And so that is a very important way by which, like the whole question of synthesize that you are asking, because once you sort of made the small notes, you can actually sort of juxtapose them and then find out whether, okay, these are the 5 articles which are arguing in favor of a certain process, for instance. There are another 3 which are disagreeing. So that helps you a lot if you are making smaller notes. So that is my very traditional, conventional, maybe old-time suggestion. I'm not very sure whether I replied to you properly.
I'll just share one of my experience, which I have already shared with my students, but for the larger audience. In fact, when I was doing MPhil, I know that we have to submit a term paper, and in the term I was doing under the guidance of my own PhD guide and MPhil guide, Professor Santakumar. So I had cited a paper, got on 1954. Okay, and but I had not read that full paper. I had read only the abstract. So while presenting the term paper, my guide could realize that I have not read the full paper and I am just bluffing on that idea. So then he asked me, Amarendra, have you read Garden 1954? Then I became silent. Then he asked, I'm asking you, yes or no? And I said no. And so we should have such a guide who can ask this, whether you have read the full paper or not. And then only we can be honest actually to the review of literature. And if you try to get a shortcut to the review of literature, then I don't think that we can really become a social scientist. But unfortunately, I also see some students who are now outsourcing the part. Like they're giving 50,000 to one person who is doing review of literature for him or her. Then some another 10-20,000 rupees for doing the data analysis, and somebody is getting another 20,000 rupees to write the thesis. And ultimately, the candidate is submitting the thesis. And when you ask the question to the candidate, what is the analysis that you have done? Then the presenter says, no, I had used a co-author to do the data analysis, so I don't know. So this is what has what is happening in our PhD works now, and but this is quite unfortunate because ideally PhD is a training program where we should learn all these things, but people are taking shortcuts. And I think I should not give a long lecture on this. So yeah, are there any other questions? Somebody has raised a hand, or you have raised a hand? So by mistake, let me. I think there was another question.
Oh, sorry.
No, I think there was another question. Let me see that. There are some question here. Some journal related issue. Yeah, can you elaborate more about review article and review journal? Can you elaborate more about review article and review journal? Sir, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Elaborate on review article. When you're saying journal, then of course we are referring to the articles in the journal, isn't it? Like, so that's
because you were telling there is a review journal.
So that was the question, or?
Yeah, there are two components. One is. Yeah, sure. Okay. No, the question is that please elaborate on a review article. How is the review article?
Review article. Oh,
yes.
That's right. Okay. No. I think that's a very good question.
Review. For reviews, you had specifically mentioned a journal. The student, I think, has got confused between a journal that publishes review articles and what is a review article. The distinction between these two.
Yeah, so there are two components. One is what is a review article, and you are specifically talking about a journal that publishes the review article. So some expand.
Okay. No, like I give you, because I'm more from economics background, let me give you, like, for instance, the Journal of Economic Perspectives is something which always carries sort of review articles relating to let's say issues in economic development. So there have been any issue of the Journal of Economic Perspectives of the American Economic Society, if you pick up, so that contains sort of a number of articles which are on, let's say, whether the debate between state and market, for instance. So on that topic, so you'll find one article which is a review article in a journal, and there is another journal which is the Journal of Reviews. So which is actually not confined only to economics. In fact, it's a kind of a It's a kind of a social science based journal in which all the articles are on different themes, and each and every article is a review article. Apart from that, you may find review articles even in a journal like, for instance, EPW. Like very often, like maybe people have reviewed 2 or 3 books together. So these are actually the book review articles. That is one form. Or at times, like people have done on, like for instance, I do not want to give an example of my own work. Like for instance, my own paper in 2004 in EPW. It's called Uneven Development and Regionalism, a critique of received theories. So that is actually a review article of starting from the whatever classical, neoclassical, Marxian, and up to the present time. So I've reviewed all the sort of major literature relating to uneven development, so that is sort of contained in one single article. So in fact, there have been several, like there is someone called Alan Scott, for instance, in the University of California. So he has very often comes up with review articles relating to regional issues, for instance. So there have been several articles which may have come in regular journals, but reviews of a particular theme. There is a separate journal called Journal of Reviews, and there are specialized journals, as I mentioned, the Journal of Economic Literature, which also focuses on only articles which are reviews. That is, so, but then of course relating to political economy and economic development, those kind of issues. So you will find similar, like for instance, there is a journal called Antipode, for instance. There is a journal, this Antipode journal, this is a kind of an interdisciplinary journal with sort of economics, geography, and law as their focus. So large number of articles in this are actually based on reviews of specific themes, and that's how they publish. So there are several journals where you may come across individual review articles, but the Journal of Reviews is a different one. That's a dedicated journal, in fact.
Okay, so somebody has raised hand. Surabhi Mishra, do you want to ask question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please ask.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I wanted to discuss, sir, I wanted to share an issue that I am facing. Sir, I'm in an initial stage of my research, having an arts background and no mathematical hold. Sir, while doing literature review, I sometimes feel perplexed while going through the mathematical derivations and high-level mathematical formulas. So I'm unable to understand that. So, sir, what should be my approach on that case? Can you please tell me?
Yes. See, the thing is, one issue is that if you are not comfortable in, let's say, econometrics or mathematical modeling, if you think that that is not something in which you are very familiar with, so I'm not very sure if you should really be sort of concerned about that part. But there have been several articles using mathematical modeling and econometrics methods, but then they come up with very interesting results. So in these instances, like if you are very keen on reading an article, but you are not able to follow the mathematical part of it, in that it will be good probably to read the conclusion, maybe read the introduction part. And if you think you are still not clear, the best is to check with a kind of a person who may be familiar with those methods. So it's not that everything you have to understand. So that is one way you can always cross-check with a scholar or a teacher who may be familiar with similar methods. So I would think that is one good way. And you can also take a call what kind of methodology you are going to use. Very often what happens, for a long time these days, it has actually come down. Very often people used to just blindly use regression analysis. So this was a kind of like they thought that the research meaning you have some data and so that you have some, you can establish the cause effect relationship, and that led to a lot of sort of discussion later, because many people who were in fact experts in econometrics, they themselves have commented on this, saying that unless there is a real need, a relevance, you must not go for, everybody should not use regression analysis to explain a certain process. So I think it is very important that we speak to peers, speak to experts on the subject and take a view. But then most articles which are using mathematical modeling, etc., they always, and I think almost invariably, the conclusions and the initial part, they definitely describe what is the focus of the paper, what is the conclusion, even if you do not understand the mathematical, whatever equations or whatever. So maybe Amarendra or Mala madam will have a better reply, but I thought I will say this much.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. No, I fully agree with you, sir. In fact, yeah, there are challenges, and also people can choose their own expertise, where you want to focus on, and you can still publish papers. So, are there any questions? I think, do you have any other questions? People who are sitting here? No? Okay. So if there are no more questions, then I think we should thank Professor Keshab Das for a very comprehensive discussion on the way of doing review of literature. And the message is loud and clear. There is no shortcut to do review of literature. You have to read, and the important, like, also message that how much time, whether you should do only 1 year review of literature or 2 years. Again, the answer is that it continues till the date of submission of your thesis, or it goes for the final editing. In fact, it so happens that by the day you are going to submit your thesis, some new article has come in the journal, and your guide tells that it has to be included because it is written by some great person. So that should go to the reference, and yeah, these are the challenges. So review of literature is a continuous affair. So yeah, thank you, sir. So thank you so much for making things very clear for the students, and I hope they will follow this. And somebody has written in the chat box that if you want to do some statistical analysis, please contact me. No, I want to say the person that this is not a business platform for anyone here, and this is a platform to basically train the participants, and so we don't encourage anyone to do business here, and making a PhD or MPhil is not a business process at all. So we discourage such things, and I hope no one will commit such mistakes in this platform in the future. Okay, so with this, now we shall conclude the session, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Okay. And I also thank all the participants for staying connected with us, and I'm sure in the future we'll also have such more programs for the benefit of the participants. And I have also shared a feedback form in the chat box, so please fill up that feedback form, and so with this we shall now conclude. Thank you so much. Sir, would you like to say something? Yes.
Yeah, just one small thing, and more as this something to do with the Orissa Economic Association one event, because all the young scholars are here. So this is for your kind information. On the 3rd of on the 4th of September, which is a Sunday. So if you are free, in fact, Amarendra will be sharing the links. So we are also having, which is also in many ways sort of like, which will be very interesting, that two very prominent speakers, Professor Ashish Kothari and Professor Rohan D'Souza. So they will be speaking broadly on this in a very interdisciplinary manner, speaking about what we roughly call as interrogating sustainability. The issues in sort of like that how much the economists should think about the environment, what about sustainability and justice. So some of the very interesting things, and that will be a largely interactive session. So I would request all of you to please do join that event. So that is not linked to my talk, but then I thought from Orissa Economic Association, I make that special request to you all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes. And we also promote, like, since this is the event of both NISER and Orissa Economics Association, like I can do some promotion of association. Like people who have not become members of Orissa Economic Association can join and take the membership, so that you get all notification and take the benefit of the association. So with this, we shall now thank again Professor Mala Ramanathan, who is present here. In fact, she also sat through the entire session in the afternoon. And thank you, Keshab sir, for sharing your valuable knowledge with the young research scholars. And I hope this will definitely benefit all our participants. So with this, we conclude. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay.
Namaste.